점수 잡는 hackers.
Hey everyone, welcome to your SAT class. So today's your second class, and we are going to finish off test 1. Now, our first passage is a paired passage. If this is the first time you're dealing with these, pay attention. I'll tell you how to deal with them. And then our second question is a geological survey. So, let's begin. Now, the introductory sentence for a paired passage will provide you with all the information on both passages. So if you take a look, we have the title of passage 1 as well as the title of passage 2 here. Now, the more important part would be definitely over here. So here they tell us about the subject matter. Both passages address the treatment of slaves in the southern United States in the 1800s. So we have our keywords here. We have the word slave, and then southern United States, which means what? Yes, we're going to talk about slave states, and this was taking place during the 1800s. Now, bearing that in mind, the next thing you're going to do is treating them as separate passages. Meaning what? Don't try to synthesize both passages. It'll just give you a headache, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to treat them separately and deal with the questions separately as well. So we're going to compare the number of questions for each passage and then prioritize what we're going to do first, okay? So follow me. Here we go. Learning from the questions. Now, if you take a look, these two are passage 1 questions. How do you know? Well, because the questions tell you. Now, it can be inferred that the author of passage 1 believes freedom is what? And then, of course, this was an evidence-based question. Now, the second question also states that passage 1, the author anticipates which of the following objections to his argument. Again, you have to read passage 1 to solve this, right? You don't have to read passage 2 to deal with these two questions. Now, on the other hand, if you take a look at the passage 2 questions here, all of them state what? Yes, all of them ask for information that you can only find in passage 2. Here, here, as well as here. So, again, think about the questions. What are they telling you? Well, they're telling you to read passage 2 and deal with these 3 questions solely, right? So, what do you want to do? Well, if you take a look, we had 2 questions for passage 1, and then we have 3 questions for passage 2, meaning you want to deal with passage 2 first because it has more questions, which means, in other words, that it is more important for you, okay? Now, let's move on. We also have both questions. Now, in this case, what you're going to do, as I will show you, is dealing with them still separately, but you're going to deal with these questions 2 times. Now, if you take a look, on which of the following points would the authors of both passages most likely agree? Now, if you take a look, both passage questions, whatever they are, now you have A, B, C, and D as always. Now, after reading passage 2, what you can do is what? Well, you can eliminate 2 answer choices that were not relevant to passage 2 alone. Now, if you're lucky, you might be left with 1 answer choice. Now, if you're not, you still have only 2 to deal with after reading passage 1. Are you following? Yes, so that's what we're going to do with these questions, and let's see how it goes. So we're going to start with passage 2. Let's read the blurb. Now, the title reads, American Slavery as It Is. And then, of course, what did we say? Well, it addresses the issue of slaves in the southern states in the 1800s. So, here goes the speech. Line 36, there's not a man on earth who does not believe that slavery is a curse. So, right off the bat, our author is telling us what? Well, his opinion on slavery is that what? It is a curse. So you know what to expect. Any negative kind of word or criticizing words should be important in this context, right? Now, whoever denies this, his lips libel his heart. Try him, clank the chains in his ears, and tell him they are for him. So we start with what? Well, he gives us a hypothetical scenario over here, and let's see what they do if we say, hey, you're a slave from today. And if you take a look, what did they say? Well, you will see what? Well, you'll see that then look at his pale lips and trembling knees, and you have nature's testimony against slavery. So even those who say that slavery is not a curse, if you actually put them in the slave's shoes, you will see them tremble and turn pale. Now let's move on, line 45. 2,700,000 persons in these states are in this condition. Is it right? Is it just? Is it benevolent? Of course, we know what the author is going to say. He's going to say, definitely not. Now let's move on. Now, everyone knows, again, that the slaveholders do these things to the slaves every day and yet it is stoutly affirmed that they treat them well and kindly. Now here you see a contrast word. Now whenever you stumble upon a contrast word, you always want to pay attention. Why? Because it's going to tell you something important. Now contrast words are yet, but, however, and the like. So make sure you pay attention to these words, okay? Now, line 66, again you see another contrast word, yet. They who plunder them of all these would fain make us believe that their soft hearts ooze out so lovingly toward their slaves that they always keep them well housed and well clad. Never push them too hard in the field, never make their dear back smart, nor let their dear stomachs go empty. So we see what? We see the author criticizing the slaveholders when they say what? Well, their soft hearts ooze out for the slaves, acting as though they actually care. There's no end to these absurdities. Are slaveholders dunces, or do they take all the rest of the world to be, that they think to be bandaged our eyes with such thin gauzes? So we see the word bandage here underlined. I've done this on purpose because to show you how marking passages that are relevant to the questions help you focus when you're reading. So I've marked it over here. Now let's move on to the questions. We're going to start with the passage 2 questions. So we start with number 35. Now, which statement best describes the technique that the author uses? But which part are we going to look at? Well, the question tells us to look at this part here. Now, in line 36 and 37, he states, there is not a man on earth who does not believe that slavery is a curse. Now, if you pay attention, what the question is actually telling you is, we're not looking at this part. We want to look at the part where the author actually advances on this point. So you have to look further back than simply line 36 and 37. Now, let's take a look at that part over here. Now, that was the beginning of the article, and when we read it, what did we see? Well, we saw him giving us what? Well, let's try this scenario. Let's try this and see how they react. So, based on this, the way that the author is advancing this point is what? Well, we can see that he presents a hypothetical scenario about slavery. So your correct answer for this would be B. Now again, pay attention to every single word in the question. You don't want to look at here, but you want to look at the part where the author advances the point, which means you go a bit further. Got it? Okay. 36, vocabulary question. Now you want to substitute a word here. Which one would you put in? Now take a look. Suppose I should seize you, rob you of your liberty, drive you into the field, and make you work without pay as long as you live. So here we're assuming that we have become slaves. And if you look at the other verbs that the author is using, seizing you, robbing you, and then what? Driving you, making you work. So these all assume what? Yes, a force of some kind, something that I do not want to do. So if you take a look at the answer choices here, we want to see what? Well, we want either C or D, correct? Now in this case, the correct answer choice is C because why? Well, urge simply indicates that you're trying to make me do something, but you're not necessarily forcing me to do it. In this context, force would be, therefore, the better choice. Now 37, the main purpose of the analogy of the bandage is to do what? So you want to read that part carefully again, and then what do you want to do? Always dissect the answer choice. Now, was it to argue that the general public is blind, or the deceptiveness, the public saying that the public is accountable for ignoring the obvious evils, or D, point out the weakness of the slaveholders' argument? Now, let's take a look at the part here. It was the last part right here, and what we see before from line 66 is what? Well, it was the part where the author talked about how slaveholders wanted us, the general public, to believe how their soft hearts went out to the slaves, how they were caring for them very well, and how they never let their dear stomachs go empty. Now, does the author believe this is true? No, he does not. And there's no end to these absurdities is the word that he uses to describe the situation. So, what is he saying when he says, are slaveholders idiots? Or do they take all the rest of the world to be that they think to bandage our eyes with such thin gauzes? Meaning what? The slaveholders are trying to trick us, and that their argument, which was above, does not make any sense. It is actually absurd according to the author. Correct? Now let's move on. If you see here, your trick would definitely have been what? Have been B, highlighting the deceptiveness of the slaveholders. But if you read the question again, now always when you get confused between two answer choices, what you want to do is not go back to the passage, but actually go back to the question over here. Was the purpose of the bandage to show us that slaveholders were deceptive? Now, how does that statement sound to you? It doesn't sound quite right, right? So, now let's take a look again. Now, was the main purpose of the bandage analogy to tell us that the slaveholders' argument was weak or that it didn't make any sense? Yes, D makes a lot more sense than saying that the bandage was to show us of their deceptiveness. So, your correct answer choice here should be D.